On my 68th birthday, I asked my son to have dinner with me. He said he was locked in vital investor meetings and had absolutely no time. I decided to go to my favorite steakhouse by myself to celebrate quietly. But when I arrived, I found him sitting right there in the center of the dining room, eating a massive feast with his wife and her mother. What I did next left the entire restaurant in absolute shock. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The pen hovered over the rectangular slip of paper on my kitchen table. $15,000. I wrote the numbers with a steady hand, feeling the heavy silence of the room press down on me. Justin paced across the worn linoleum floor of my kitchen, running his hands through his hair while staring at his phone screen. He wore a sharp navy suit that cost more than my first car. He breathed heavily, tapping his expensive leather shoes against the floorboards, as if my kitchen were a prison cell, keeping him from something far more important. Dad, you have to understand, the payroll software crashed, and the vendor is threatening to lock us out of the system, Justin said without looking up from his screen. If I do not wire this money by noon, the entire logistics startup goes under. I will lose the warehouse team. I will lose the transport contracts. I just need this bridge loan to get us through Friday. I signed the bottom line of the check. I spent 40 years as a regional logistics manager for a major freight company. I knew the supply chain industry inside and out. I knew that vendors did not simply lock you out over a single missed cycle without weeks of prior warnings and collection notices. I knew the numbers Justin was feeding me did not align with standard operating procedures. I tore the check from the ledger and slid it across the table. Here is the bridge loan, Justin. I pushed the paper toward his side of the table. He snatched the check, instantly folding it and shoving it into his suit pocket before the ink was completely dry. Thanks, Dad, he said, already turning toward the front door. You are a lifesaver. I will have my accountant draft the repayment schedule next week. The investors are breathing down my neck, and I have to get back to the office right now. Justin, wait, I said. My voice was calm and even. I remained seated at the table, watching his hand grab the brass doorknob. Today is my 68th birthday. I was thinking we could grab a quiet dinner tonight. Just the two of us. Maybe go to that steakhouse downtown. Justin froze halfway out the door. He glanced at his luxury watch and let out a loud, exasperated sigh. Dad, I really cannot tonight. I am locked in back-to-back meetings with vital investors until at least 10 o'clock. We are trying to secure our Series B funding, and I cannot step away from the table. We will do something next month, okay? I promise. He walked out and pulled the front door shut behind him. He did not say happy birthday. He did not look me in the eye. The lock clicked into place, leaving me alone in the quiet kitchen. I did not feel a sudden wave of sorrow. I felt cold, hard clarity. I pulled the leather-bound checkbook ledger toward me and ran my index finger down the columns of recorded numbers. $5,000 for server upgrades in March. $12,000 for fleet maintenance in July. $20,000 for a warehouse deposit last November. I added the new $15,000 entry to the bottom of the page. The total amount of financial support I had funneled into his business over the past 3 years now sat at exactly $185,000. I closed the ledger. I had sacrificed my retirement security to fund his entrepreneurial dreams under the guise of secured corporate loans. I had endured his rushed visits, his dismissive tone, and his constant financial crises because he was my son. But staring at the empty doorway, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. I was not a father to him. I was a limitless line of credit. I decided I was not going to sit in an empty house on my birthday. I put on my coat, grabbed my keys, and drove downtown. The steakhouse was dimly lit and smelled of roasted garlic and charred cedar. It was a place meant for celebrations and expensive corporate dinners. The hostess led me to a small, shadowed booth in the back corner of the room, away from the main floor. I ordered a simple ribeye and a glass of water. I did not want a grand celebration anymore. I just wanted to eat my meal in peace and process the hollow reality of my relationship with my son. As I took my first sip of water, a shrill, piercing laugh echoed over the clatter of silverware and the low hum of conversation. I knew that laugh immediately. It belonged to my daughter-in-law, Natalie. I shifted in my booth and looked through the decorative wooden slats separating my section from the main dining room. There, sitting at the largest center table under a glowing chandelier, was Justin. He was not wearing the panicked expression of a man facing a payroll crisis. He was leaning back in his chair, holding a glass of dark red wine, laughing loudly. Natalie sat beside him, wearing a sparkling cocktail dress. Across from them sat Beatrice, her 58-year-old mother. There were no vital investors. There were no back-to-back meetings. There were 3 massive seafood towers on the table, empty oyster shells piled high on crushed ice, and 2 empty bottles of imported wine. I remained perfectly still in the shadows of my booth. My steak arrived, but I did not touch my knife. I watched the table intently. Beatrice raised a fresh glass of champagne into the air, demanding the attention of her daughter and my son. To Justin, Beatrice announced, her voice projecting clearly across the space between our tables. The best son-in-law a mother could ever ask for. Thank you for making this possible. I never thought I would be able to afford the penthouse level, but that deposit you secured today made it happen. Natalie clinked her glass against her mother's. We told you we would take care of it, Mom. Justin moved some corporate funds around this morning to cover the final closing costs. You get the keys to the luxury condo on Friday. Justin smiled and took a long sip of his wine. Do not worry about it, Beatrice. The business accounts are flush right now. We had to label it as a vendor expense to keep the books clean, but it is totally handled. Cheers to your new condo. I stared at the 3 of them, celebrating. The puzzle pieces locked together with devastating precision. The $15,000 check I wrote this morning was not for a crashing payroll software. It was the final installment for a $150,000 down payment on Beatrice's new luxury condo. My life savings, the $185,000 supposedly keeping my son's logistics startup afloat, had been systematically funneled into real estate for his mother-in-law. He had lied to my face in my own kitchen, pocketed my retirement funds, and left me alone on my birthday to treat his wife's mother to a lavish feast. I did not shout. I did not storm over to the table and flip the seafood towers onto the floor. I sat in my booth and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my banking application and pulled up the legal documents folder I kept saved on my cloud drive. When I initially gave Justin the seed money for his business 3 years ago, I did not just hand him cash. As a logistics manager, I knew the importance of paperwork. I had set up the account as a corporate entity and designated myself as the primary financial guarantor to protect my initial investment. I watched their table from the shadows. The waiter approached them, holding a sleek black leather check presenter. He placed it gently in front of Justin. I could see the printed receipt from where I sat. It was incredibly long. Justin barely glanced at the total. He reached into his suit pocket, the same pocket where he had shoved my $15,000 check hours earlier, and pulled out a heavy black corporate credit card. He dropped it onto the leather tray with an arrogant flick of his wrist. I wiped my mouth with my linen napkin, stood up from my booth, and walked directly across the dining room floor. The waiter was just reaching for the leather tray when I stepped between him and the table. I placed my hand firmly over the black credit card, pinning it to the leather surface. "Excuse me," I said to the waiter. "I need to speak with the restaurant manager immediately." Justin looked up, his wine glass frozen halfway to his mouth. All the color instantly drained from his face. "Dad," he stammered. "What are you doing here? I thought you were at home." Natalie dropped her fork. Her jaw went slack as she stared at me. Beatrice lowered her champagne glass, looking mildly annoyed by the interruption. I did not look at my son or his wife. I kept my hand pinned over the credit card. The restaurant manager, a tall man in a tailored gray suit, hurried over to the table, sensing the sudden spike in tension. "Sir, is there a problem here?" the manager asked, looking between me and Justin. Yes, there is a significant legal problem, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. This man is attempting to pay a bill using a stolen corporate credit card. I am the primary account holder and the legal guarantor of that card. I am officially reporting it as unauthorized fraudulent use right now. Justin shot out of his chair. His face turned deep red. Dad, what the hell are you doing? Have you lost your mind? Put your voice down. People are staring at us. The manager looked alarmed. Sir, he said to me, that is a very serious accusation. I will need to see some identification and proof of account ownership before I can confiscate a patron's payment method. I pulled my wallet from my coat. I handed the manager my state-issued driver license. I then held up my smartphone displaying the certified articles of incorporation and the banking agreement clearly showing my name, Vincent Pierce, as the primary guarantor and sole authorizing officer for the account associated with that exact card number. You can verify the last 4 digits on the card under my hand, I told the manager. This individual has been illegally commingling corporate funds for personal real estate transactions and is now attempting to use my guaranteed credit line to fund a luxury dinner. I want the card canceled and destroyed immediately. The manager inspected my license, compared the name to the legal documents on my screen, and then looked down at the black card resting on the tray. He nodded slowly, realizing the severe legal liability the restaurant would face if they processed a flagged fraudulent transaction. The manager reached out and pulled the card from under my hand. He produced a small pair of utility scissors from his apron pocket and cut the heavy black plastic clean in half right in front of Justin's face. I cannot accept this form of payment, the manager said, placing the 2 severed halves of the credit card back onto the leather tray. The total for the table is $1,200. I will need an alternative payment method immediately. Natalie gasped, pressing her hands over her mouth. Justin stared at the severed pieces of plastic, as if they were a bomb that had just detonated. Dad, he whispered, his voice shaking with absolute panic. You cannot do this. You know I do not have personal funds to cover a bill this large. All my liquid cash is tied up in the escrow account for the condo closing tomorrow. Beatrice slammed her hands on the table. This is outrageous. Justin, who is this man, and why is he ruining our celebration dinner? Make him leave right now and pay the bill. This man is the person who bought your new condo. Beatrice, I said, turning my gaze to her. The $15,000 Justin wired to your escrow account today came directly from my retirement savings under the guise of a fake corporate payroll emergency. You are drinking my champagne. You are eating my oysters. But you are going to have to pay for them yourself. I reached into my pocket and pulled out 2 crisp $20 bills. I dropped them onto the corner of the table. This covers my single ribeye and my glass of water, I told the manager. I have no association with the rest of this bill. Justin lunged forward, trying to grab my arm. Dad, please. You are embarrassing, Natalie. You are humiliating us in public. Just pay the bill and we can go back to my house and talk about this like adults. I will explain the real estate investment to you. It is a guaranteed return. You have absolutely nothing left to explain to me, I said, stepping back to avoid his grasp. You looked me in the eye. On my birthday. Took my money, lied about your business failing, and came here to celebrate stealing my future. You made your choices, Justin. Now you get to experience the consequences. I turned my back on them and began walking toward the exit. Behind me, the table erupted into total chaos. Natalie began crying hysterically, asking Justin how they were going to leave the building. The manager informed them that if they could not produce a working credit card, he would be forced to call the police to report a theft of services. Beatrice began screaming at Justin, demanding he fix the situation immediately. I paused at the front doors and looked back one final time. Justin was frantically emptying his pockets, finding nothing but lint. Natalie was sobbing into her napkin. Beatrice, her face purple with rage and humiliation, was angrily unbuckling her diamond watch and shoving it toward the restaurant manager as collateral, just so they would not be arrested. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped out into the cool night air. The streetlights illuminated the empty sidewalk. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt free. I walked to my car, climbed inside, and started the engine. The financial lifeline was cut, but I knew Justin would not surrender easily. He would try to retaliate to force me back into compliance. He would quickly discover that severing his dinner payment was only the very first step of my retaliation. The sound of splintering pine shattered the quiet morning. The front door of my farmhouse flew inward, crashing against the entryway wall with a violent, deafening thud. The brass strike plate tore free from the doorframe, clattering onto the hardwood floor. I did not flinch. I sat at my kitchen table holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, waiting. I knew he would come. A thief always returns to the scene of the crime when his pockets are suddenly empty. Justin stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. His breathing was ragged, and his expensive Italian loafers tracked damp mud across my clean floor. He looked nothing like the polished tech executive he pretended to be. He looked exactly like a desperate man whose lies had finally caught up with him. He halted at the edge of the kitchen island, gripping the granite countertop so hard his knuckles turned white. "You are completely out of your mind," Justin screamed, slamming his palms down on the stone. "Do you have any idea what you did last night?" Beatrice had to leave her diamond watch with the restaurant manager just so they would not call the police. Natalie was sobbing in the parking lot. The valet staff was laughing at us. "You humiliated my wife and my mother-in-law in front of half the city." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "I stopped a fraudulent transaction on my corporate account," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on his panicked eyes. "If you found the consequences humiliating, perhaps you should not have been spending stolen money to buy them oysters on my birthday." Justin recoiled as if I had struck him physically, but his rage quickly masked his panic. "It was not stolen money," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "It is my business. You invested in my business. How I allocate those funds to maintain family harmony is my decision. I need a wire transfer right now. You are going to log into your account and send $20,000 to my personal checking account to cover the restaurant bill, retrieve the watch, and compensate for the emotional distress you caused. If you do that right now, we can pretend this entire pathetic tantrum never happened." I set my coffee mug down on the table. The ceramic clink echoed in the tense space between us. "You do not have a business, Justin," I said. "You have a glorified piggy bank that I have been funding. For 3 years, poured $185,000 of my retirement savings into your logistics startup because you swore you were building a legacy. You told me you needed capital for servers, for warehouse leases, for payroll. You tried to con a man who spent 40 years auditing freight manifests for a living. I know what a supply chain looks like, and I know what a grift looks like. There was no payroll crisis yesterday morning when I handed you that $15,000 check. You funneled corporate funds directly into the escrow account of your mother-in-law's luxury condo. You used my money to buy her a penthouse." Justin paced frantically across the kitchen, running his hands over his face. "You do not understand how real estate investments work," he snapped, attempting to regain his arrogant posture. "We were going to flip the condo in 2 years and return your initial seed money with interest. I was doing you a favor by diversifying your portfolio. You have absolutely no right to freeze that card." I stood up from the table, pushing my chair back. "I did not freeze the card," I stated clearly. "I reported it as a stolen instrument used in a corporate embezzlement scheme. The bank fraud department is already auditing the entire history of that account, line by line. They are tracking every single dollar you spent over the last 36 months. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him deathly pale. His arrogant posture collapsed, leaving only raw desperation. "You called the bank fraud department," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Dad, you have to call them back. You have to tell them you made a mistake, that you authorized those charges. If they audit the corporate ledger, they will see the transfers to Beatrice. They will see the car payments. They will freeze everything. They will lock the startup accounts. Natalie will leave me. You have to fix this right now." I crossed my arms over my chest and looked at the man standing in my kitchen. I am not fixing anything I said. You engineered this disaster. You chose to lie to my face. You chose to treat me not as a father, but as an ignorant cash machine. You chose to leave me sitting alone on my birthday so you could toast to your own cleverness using my money. The audit proceeds. Justin stared at me, his chest heaving. His desperation hardened into a cold, vicious malice. The mask of the panicked son vanished entirely, replaced by a venomous cruelty. He took a step toward me, his eyes narrowing. "You are a bitter, lonely old man," he hissed. "I was the only family you had left. Natalie and I were going to let you see your future grandchildren. We were going to make sure you were taken care of when your mind finally started to go. But if you do not pick up that phone and wire me the funds to fix this right now, I am done with you. I will cut you out of my life forever. We will never visit. We will never call. You will rot in this empty house and you will die completely alone." The threat hung in the air heavy and designed to shatter my resolve. He expected me to break. He expected me to beg for his presence, to trade my life savings for crumbs of his conditional affection. I turned my back to him and walked into the adjacent living room. I reached into the hall closet and pulled out a medium-sized cardboard box. I had packed it late last night after returning from the steakhouse. I carried the heavy box back into the kitchen and set it on the table right in front of him. Justin looked at the cardboard defensively. "What is this?" he demanded. I removed the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of packing paper, were his childhood soccer trophies, his high school debate medals, and the framed college diploma he had left in his old bedroom. "These are the last remnants of the boy I thought I raised," I told him. "The man standing in my kitchen is a stranger. Take your trophies and leave my property." Justin stared at the box, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He looked up at me, searching for any trace of hesitation, any sign that I was bluffing. He found nothing but absolute, unyielding resolve. "You are going to regret this," he spat, grabbing the box and holding it to his chest. "You are going to beg me to come back." I remained perfectly silent. I raised my arm and pointed a single steady finger toward the splintered front door. Justin glared at me, his jaw clenched tight. He turned on his heel and marched out of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. He kicked the broken door wide open and stormed out to his car. I followed him to the entryway. I watched him throw the cardboard box into the trunk of his luxury sedan, slam the lid shut, and speed out of my driveway, spraying loose gravel into the grass. I did not shed a single tear. I stepped back inside and pulled the shattered door closed. I walked straight to my workbench, retrieved a heavy-duty deadbolt I had purchased at dawn, and a power drill. I began removing the old compromised hardware immediately. The screws whined as I backed them out of the wood. I aligned the new heavy brass strike plate, driving the fresh screws deep into the doorframe, securing the perimeter of my home. The physical lock was merely a formality. The true barrier had already been established. The financial hemorrhage was contained, and the emotional severing was complete. But as I slid the new brass key into my pocket, I knew a man like Justin would not simply walk away from a severed funding source. The bank audit would inevitably expose the depth of his embezzlement, and when a parasite is completely detached from its host, it does not quietly accept starvation. It attacks. I walked back to the kitchen table to gather my documents. The war had only just begun. The drive to the pharmacy took exactly 12 minutes. I needed my blood pressure medication. The morning confrontation with my son had left a tight pressure building behind my temples and a dull ache in the center of my chest. I parked my car in the lot and walked through the sliding glass doors, feeling the artificial chill of the store hit my face. I approached the counter and handed my identification to the pharmacist. He was a young man who had filled my prescriptions for the last 2 years. He typed my name into the system, retrieved the small white paper bag from a plastic bin, and scanned the barcode. The total was $42.50. I reached into my wallet, pulled out my personal debit card, and inserted the chip into the card reader. The machine beeped once. A red error message flashed across the digital screen stating the transaction was declined. The young pharmacist frowned and told me the chip reader had been acting up all morning. He wiped the card on his shirt and inserted it again. The machine beeped a second time. The same red text illuminated the screen telling me the card had been rejected due to insufficient funds. The pharmacist looked down at the counter, avoiding my eyes, and quietly suggested that perhaps my bank had placed a temporary hold on the account for suspicious activity. I did not argue. I knew my personal checking account held well over $3,000 specifically reserved for monthly living expenses and medical necessities. A single prescription charge should not have triggered a fraud alert. I politely told the pharmacist I would return later to pick up the medication. I walked out of the store, keeping my posture straight, despite the sudden sinking feeling in my stomach. The midday sun beat down on the asphalt as I unlocked my car and climbed into the driver's seat. I closed the door, shutting out the noise of the busy street. The air inside the cabin was stifling, but I did not turn on the engine. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and opened my personal banking application. My thumb hovered over the biometric scanner for a fraction of a second before pressing down. The screen transitioned to a loading icon spinning endlessly as the cellular data connected to the financial servers. The main dashboard materialized on the glowing screen. I stared at the bold black numbers displayed at the very top. The available balance in my primary checking account read $0.00. I blinked, thinking there had to be a synchronization error. I refreshed the screen, pulling down with my thumb to force the application to update. The numbers remained unchanged. $0. I immediately tapped the screen to open my connected high-yield savings account. This was the secure repository where I had parked the entirety of my life savings outside of my pension. It was the financial bedrock I had spent 40 years building, meant to cover my final years and medical emergencies. The balance display loaded. It read $12.14. $85,000 had simply vanished. The pressure behind my eyes intensified, turning into a sharp, throbbing rhythm that matched my accelerating heartbeat. I did not throw my phone. I did not scream into the empty car. I drew in a long breath of the stale, hot air and forced my mind into a state of absolute clinical detachment. A thief leaves a trail. I tapped the Recent Transactions tab and scrolled down to the activity log for the last 24 hours. There it was. A single outbound wire transfer initiated exactly 45 minutes ago. The transfer had completely drained both my checking and savings accounts, sweeping the funds into an external routing number. I clicked on the digital receipt to view the authorization details, expecting to see a hacked password or a spoofed location. Instead, the transaction history displayed a specific processing code. The transfer was not flagged as suspicious because it had been authorized in person at a physical branch location using verified legal documentation. The notes attached to the digital receipt indicated that the withdrawal was executed under the authority of a medical power of attorney. The words on the screen anchored me to a memory I had buried deep in my subconscious. 5 years ago, I collapsed in my kitchen and woke up in the intensive care unit of the county hospital. The doctors informed me that 3 of my coronary arteries were completely blocked. They needed to crack my chest open and perform an emergency triple bypass surgery. The survival rate was favorable, but the recovery would require weeks of heavy sedation and ventilator support. My son stood by my hospital bed looking terrified. He handed me a clipboard and a blue ink pen. He told me the hospital administration required a designated medical proxy to make health decisions and handle my personal bills while I was unconscious in the recovery ward. I signed the document without hesitation. I gave my son absolute legal authority over my life and my finances because I trusted him implicitly. When I recovered from the surgery and returned home, the document simply faded from my mind. I assumed it was voided or filed away in a dusty cabinet, never to be needed again unless my heart failed a second time. Sitting in my sweltering car, I realized the horrifying truth. That piece of paper had never been voided. My son had kept the certified document safely tucked away for half a decade, preserving it like a loaded weapon. When I destroyed his corporate credit card at the steakhouse last night, I severed his access to my business capital. In retaliation, he retrieved the medical power of attorney, drove to my personal bank branch, and presented the document to a teller. He weaponized a legal instrument designed to protect my life in order to execute my total financial ruin. He legally declared me incapacitated behind my back, so he could empty my life savings before the lunch hour. I sat in the overwhelming heat of the car, analyzing the brutal efficiency of his strategy. He knew I needed my blood pressure medication. He knew I relied on my personal checking account to buy groceries, pay the utility bills, and fuel my vehicle. By draining the $85,000, he intended to paralyze me completely. He wanted me to stand at a pharmacy counter and face the humiliation of a declined card. He wanted me to return to my empty house, open my bare refrigerator, and realize I did not have a single dollar left to buy a loaf of bread. This was not a simple theft. This was a calculated siege. He was systematically cutting off my supply lines, hoping to starve me into submission. He fully expected me to call him in tears, begging for access to my own money, ready to apologize and surrender. My chest ached with a deep, hollow pain that had nothing to do with my previous cardiac surgery. It was the physical manifestation of a broken bond. A son might steal to cover a desperate debt, but only a truly malicious adversary would use his father's medical vulnerability as a weapon of extortion. The boy I had raised, the child I had taught to ride a bicycle and read a map, was entirely gone. He had been replaced by a predator. I pressed my thumb against the power button on the phone and locked the screen. The immediate problem was severe. My liquid capital was completely gone. I had no access to emergency cash. If my incoming pension checks were routed to that compromised checking account, my son would automatically seize those funds as soon as they deposited. I had to assume he was already attempting to leverage the power of attorney against my property deed and my retirement portfolio. The longer I sat in this parking lot, the more time he had to solidify his control over my entire existence. I reached for the ignition key and turned it. The engine roared to life and the air conditioning began blasting cold air across my face. My hands gripped the steering wheel with absolute certainty. The shock had passed, replaced by an icy, strategic focus. I had spent decades managing logistical networks, anticipating disruptions, and outmaneuvering corporate competitors. I knew how to cut off a compromised route and establish a secure operational base. My son believed he had orchestrated a brilliant checkmate by stealing my savings. He believed an old retired man would simply collapse under the weight of financial starvation. He did not understand that by utilizing the power of attorney to steal my personal funds, he had crossed a permanent legal threshold. He had escalated a family dispute into a felony-level fiduciary fraud. He had provided me with the exact ammunition I needed to destroy his entire life. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the pharmacy parking lot. I did not drive toward my home. I bypassed the residential streets and merged onto the highway, heading directly toward the central financial district. I needed to verify the exact time of the transaction, identify the branch manager who approved the withdrawal, and secure a certified copy of the specific power of attorney document my son had presented. I needed to establish an irrefutable paper trail before he could attempt to launder my $85,000 into his mother-in-law's real estate escrow account. The traffic on the highway was thick, but my mind moved with absolute clarity. I was no longer a father trying to teach his son a lesson about gratitude. I was a man defending his survival against a hostile threat. Every intersection I crossed, every mile marker I passed, solidified my resolve. My son wanted to bleed me dry to see how long I could last without my resources. He was about to discover that when you force a man into a corner and strip away his compassion, you leave him with nothing but ruthless efficiency. I gripped the wheel tighter, watching the towering glass structures of the banking district approach on the horizon, preparing to execute my next maneuver. I parked my truck in the visitor lot of the First National Bank branch, leaving the engine running for a brief moment to gather my thoughts. I walked through the heavy glass doors, bypassing the standard teller line entirely. I stepped directly into the carpeted office area and stood in the doorway of the branch manager. Mr. Gable was a man I had known for over a decade. He looked up from his dual monitors, and the immediate shift in his posture told me everything. He knew exactly why I was there. "Vincent, please have a seat," Gable said, his voice laced with practiced corporate sympathy. "I was just reviewing the transaction log. I assume you received the notification regarding your savings balance." I did not sit down. I kept my hands at my sides and looked down at him. 10 minutes ago, my entire life savings was wired to an external routing number, I stated. "I need you to confirm the authorization protocol used to bypass the security holds on that account." Gable swallowed hard and pulled a printed document from a manila folder on his desk. "Justin brought in a certified medical power of attorney this morning," Gable explained. "The document was notarized 5 years ago and granted him absolute fiduciary control over your liquid assets. He presented documentation suggesting you were experiencing acute cognitive decline and required emergency long-term care funding. Our legal department reviewed the seal and approved the transfer exactly 12 minutes before you walked into this building." The air in the office felt dense and metallic. Gable was bracing for an emotional explosion. He expected me to shout, to demand a reversal, to threaten legal action against the bank for releasing my funds without calling me first. I gave him nothing. I knew the rigid architecture of banking regulations. Once a certified wire transfer cleared the Federal Reserve based on a legally binding proxy document, the originating bank had no power to claw the money back. Begging Gable to reverse the theft would be a waste of vital operational time. "I need you to freeze the routing pathways for my incoming corporate pension," I instructed, keeping my tone absolutely flat. "Reject all future direct deposits from the freight union immediately." Gable looked stunned by my lack of outrage. "Vincent, if I reject the pension deposits, they will bounce back to the union," he warned. "You will not have access to your monthly income." "That is exactly the point," I replied. "Execute the freeze right now." I watched Gable type the commands into his terminal. He confirmed the routing block was active. I turned and walked out of the branch without another word. The $85,000 was gone, but I still possessed a guaranteed monthly income of $6,000 from my logistics career. Justin would naturally assume that income would continue to pool in my checking account, where he could easily harvest it using the same stolen authority. By rejecting the deposits at the source, I effectively starved the compromised account. I drove 3 miles across town to a completely different financial institution. Midland Fidelity was a direct competitor to my old bank. I parked and walked into the immaculate modern lobby, requesting to speak with a senior wealth manager. A woman named Sarah escorted me to a glass-walled office. I did not engage in small talk. I handed her my identification and a secondary form of state-issued proof. "I need to establish a blind trust account immediately," I told her. "The trust must be structured with a unique federal tax identification number distinct from my personal Social Security digits. You will list me as the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. Furthermore, I require a hard lock on all outward transfers. No funds can leave this institution without my physical presence and my biometric verification." Sarah processed my requests with professional efficiency. As she drafted the paperwork, she asked for the name of the new trust. I thought about the 30 years I spent securing freight lines across the country. In the logistics industry, when a supply chain is compromised by a hostile tissue, you do not try to repair the broken route. You establish a ghost line. You move your critical assets off the primary grid and let the enemy waste their resources attacking an empty shell. "Name it the Ironclad Logistics Trust," I instructed. I spent the next 40 minutes signing heavily formalized documents. I transferred my secondary emergency fund, a small cash of $4,000 I kept hidden in a safe at home, into the new, secure trust. I used Sarah's office phone to contact the Freight Union Pension Board. I provided them with the new routing sequence for the blind trust and instructed them to bypass my old checking account permanently. I established a series of verbal passwords with the pension director, ensuring that no one, not even a family member, holding a power of attorney, could redirect my monthly income without speaking a specific randomized code phrase. I walked out of Midland Fidelity carrying a single manila envelope containing my new financial armor. I climbed back into my vehicle and locked the doors. I sat in the quiet isolation of the driver's seat and pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I opened my email application. My screen was already populated with 3 automated security alerts from various institutions. The first alert was from my primary life insurance provider. An unauthorized user had attempted to log into the online portal to change the primary beneficiary on my policy. The system had temporarily locked the account due to multiple failed password attempts. The second alert was from the county property tax office, indicating a digital request had been submitted to pull the official deed records for my farmhouse. The third alert was from my cellular provider, notifying me that a request to port my phone number to a new device was pending authorization. Justin was not just taking my savings. He was probing every single vulnerability in my perimeter. He was trying to seize my life insurance, steal the title to my property, and hijack my cellular communications to intercept any 2-factor authentication codes. He was attempting to erase my digital footprint and assume total control of my identity. I watched the alerts multiply on my screen. This was the moment the final illusion of my family fractured into dust. My son had transformed his mother-in-law's financial crisis into a coordinated assault against my survival. They expected me to panic. They expected me to feel the crushing weight of isolation and surrender my autonomy out of fear. They believed that because I was 68 years old, I lacked the technological fluency and the ruthlessness required to defend myself. They failed to realize that managing global supply chains required anticipating sabotage at every level. I knew how to isolate a threat. I knew how to sever a gangrenous limb to save the body. I systematically went through my smartphone and changed every single password to a complex alphanumeric sequence. I activated secondary authenticators routed to a newly purchased encrypted email address. I contacted the major credit bureaus directly from my car and locked my social security number, preventing anyone from opening new lines of debt in my name. I called the county clerk's office and placed a fraud alert on my property deed, mandating that any transfer of ownership required a mandatory in-person appearance before a judge. I placed the phone down on the passenger seat. The financial perimeter was now fully secured. I took a moment to analyze the scope of the attack. Justin could not execute this level of synchronized fraud alone. Natalie had to be managing the digital infiltration targeting my life insurance and property records, while Justin manipulated the banking documents. Beatrice was the eager recipient waiting to absorb my life savings into her real estate portfolio. They were operating as a unified syndicate, actively coordinating my total erasure. The stolen $85,000 was currently locked inside Beatrice's luxury condo escrow account, but my future income, my property, and my identity were barricaded behind impenetrable digital steel. Justin had fired the opening salvo by exploiting a document I signed when I was bleeding on an operating table. He believed that tactical strike guaranteed his unconditional victory and total dominance over my life. He assumed my love for him would create a fatal hesitation, preventing me from striking back with equal force. I shifted my car into gear and steered out of the parking lot. The defensive maneuvers were complete. It was time to shift to the offensive. I needed a professional who understood how to destroy a hostile corporate entity without leaving fingerprints. I needed a man who viewed litigation not as a pursuit of justice, but as a mechanism of absolute financial ruin. I drove toward the downtown business district, preparing to assemble my arsenal. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the reception area of the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the city. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany, and the floors were polished black marble. There were no comforting family portraits or soft ambient lighting. The atmosphere was deliberately sterile and intimidating. This was a place where multi-million-dollar companies came to destroy their rivals. I walked past the reception desk and was escorted directly down a long, quiet hallway. I did not feel out of place. I felt exactly where I needed to be. I was led into a massive corner office overlooking the sprawling downtown district. Sitting behind an expansive glass desk was Gordon. He was a senior partner known throughout the financial sector for his absolute lack of mercy. He did not lose cases, and he did not tolerate emotional theatrics from his clients. I took a seat in the heavy leather chair opposite his desk. I did not offer a handshake. I did not waste his time with a tragic story about a broken family or a grieving father. I simply unlatched my thick leather briefcase and placed a stack of documents directly onto the center of the glass surface. Gordon folded his hands together and looked at me. His eyes were cold and calculating. I told him that I required his immediate services for a hostile financial asset recovery. I explained that the opposing party was my own son. Gordon did not flinch or offer any fake sympathy. He merely nodded and reached for the stack of papers. I laid out the entire arsenal of evidence I had gathered. I presented the original articles of incorporation for the logistics startup. I showed him the signed legal agreements establishing me as the primary secured creditor with a verified lien against all corporate assets. I handed him the bank statements from the previous evening, showing the illegal use of corporate funds for a private luxury dinner. Finally, I placed the certified copy of the medical power of attorney on top of the pile. I told Gordon that my son had used that specific medical proxy document to completely drain my personal checking and high-yield savings accounts a mere 3 hours ago. I informed him that $85,000 had been stolen from my possession while I was standing at a pharmacy counter. Gordon picked up the medical proxy and read the fine print with terrifying speed. He recognized the brutal efficiency of the theft immediately. A family dispute over borrowed money was a civil matter, but using a medical document to bypass bank security and steal life savings was a felony-level fiduciary fraud. Gordon set the paper down and turned to his array of computer monitors. He told me that we needed to track the exact destination of the $85,000 before my son could attempt to launder the cash through offshore accounts or dummy corporations. Wire transfers leave a permanent digital footprint, and Gordon had the necessary clearance to follow that trail through the federal banking networks. The massive office was completely silent, except for the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. I sat perfectly still, watching the reflection of the data scrolling across his glasses. I felt a cold detachment settle over my mind. The man stealing my money was no longer my child. He was a hostile operative, and I was watching a mercenary trace his location. Gordon stopped typing and leaned closer to his primary monitor. He highlighted a specific string of numbers on the screen. He found the routing destination. The $85,000 did not go to a medical facility or a long-term care home. The stolen funds were wired directly into a commercial escrow account managed by a prominent local real estate broker. Gordon opened a secondary window and accessed the municipal property registry. He cross-referenced the escrow routing number with pending real estate transactions scheduled for the current week. He turned the monitor so I could see the results. The numbers aligned with absolute devastating precision. The $85,000 my son stole from my life savings perfectly matched the final closing costs and the remaining deposit required for a penthouse condominium located in the luxury district. Gordon pulled up the pending deed for the property. The primary purchaser listed on the legal document was Beatrice. Justin had orchestrated a massive felony fraud using a proxy designed for my medical emergencies, just to purchase a luxury home for his mother-in-law. He stripped away my financial security to elevate her social status. Gordon looked at me, waiting for an emotional breakdown. He expected me to shout or express profound sorrow at the depth of the betrayal. I simply stared at the name on the screen and told him to continue digging. I knew that a parasite rarely stops at a single point of extraction. If Justin was bold enough to weaponize a medical document, his accomplices were likely probing other vulnerabilities. Gordon agreed and initiated a comprehensive asset sweep. He ran my social security number and my federal tax identification through the state databases. He verified that the fraud alert I placed on my farmhouse deed was active and securely blocking any unauthorized transfers. He checked my life insurance policy and confirmed the login portals remained locked. My digital perimeter was holding strong against their ongoing infiltration attempts. Then Gordon opened the State Department of Motor Vehicles database. He asked me to confirm the specific make and model of the primary vehicle I drove. I described my heavy-duty pickup truck, detailing the year and the license plate number. I stated clearly that I owned the vehicle outright and held the physical title in my secure filing cabinet at home. Gordon typed the information into the search bar and hit the enter key. The system loaded the current registration file for the truck. Gordon did not speak. He simply rotated the large monitor back toward my side of the desk. I focused my eyes on the bold text, displaying the current legal ownership status. The vehicle was no longer registered to Vincent Pierce. The official transfer of ownership had been processed and approved exactly 3 weeks ago. The new legally registered owner of my pickup truck was Natalie. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the glass desk. I asked Gordon to pull up the digital scan of the original bill of sale used to process the transfer. He clicked a secondary link, and a scanned document materialized on the screen. The paperwork claimed that I had gifted the vehicle to my daughter-in-law for the sum of $0. At the bottom of the page, resting on the signature line, was my name. It was a clumsy, jagged forgery of my handwriting. The loops were wrong, and the pressure of the pen strokes was entirely inconsistent with my actual signature. The sheer scale of their coordinated syndicate operation finally became crystal clear. 3 weeks ago, while Justin was sitting in my kitchen complaining about his startup logistics and asking for more bridge loans, his wife had been quietly wandering through my farmhouse. Natalie had slipped into my private office, opened my secure filing cabinet, and stolen the physical title to my only vehicle. She had sat down, forged my signature, transferring the asset to herself, and mailed the fraudulent document to the state registry. They were systematically dismantling my entire life from the inside out. They wanted to strip me of my savings, my investments, and my mobility. They intended to leave me absolutely destitute, trapped in an isolated farmhouse without even a truck to drive to the grocery store. Gordon watched my face closely. He pointed out that the forged DMV document elevated the situation from financial abuse to a multi-layered criminal conspiracy involving grand theft auto. He asked me to define my desired outcome. He explained that we could send a demand letter threatening civil litigation if the assets were not returned within 24 hours. He offered to negotiate a private settlement to avoid a messy public trial that could embarrass the family name. I looked away from the forged signature and met his cold, calculating eyes. I told him I had absolutely no interest in a private settlement or a polite demand letter. I did not want my money quietly returned, and I did not want to protect the family name. I wanted the fake logistics startup completely liquidated. I wanted the luxury condominium seized as stolen corporate collateral. I wanted the forged vehicle documents and the fraudulent medical proxy handed directly over to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. Gordon smiled for the very first time since I entered his office. It was a sharp, predatory expression. He understood exactly what kind of war we were waging. Because Justin had illegally co-mingled the corporate startup funds with Beatrice's personal real estate purchase, he had destroyed the protective barrier separating the two entities. Gordon explained that we could now legally pierce the corporate veil. The luxury penthouse was no longer a private residence. It was legally classified as stolen corporate collateral purchased with embezzled funds from my secured business loan. The trap was fully designed and ready to be set. Beatrice believed she was moving into a palace funded by a wealthy, successful son-in-law. She was actually walking straight into a financial cage. Natalie believed she had cleverly stolen my truck to limit my mobility. She had actually provided the state with documented proof of her own felony forgery. Justin believed he had achieved total dominance by draining my bank accounts. He had actually triggered an irreversible legal audit that would annihilate his entire existence. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and buttoned my coat. I authorized Gordon to draft the quiet seizure of the property and to prepare the civil racketeering lawsuit. I knew Justin and Natalie would soon realize that their access to my pension and my property deed had been blocked. When they discovered those closed doors, they would panic and launch one final desperate attack to secure total control over me. I told Gordon we would wait for them to make that ultimate irreversible mistake. I walked out of the law firm and stepped back into the bright city streets, ready to face the absolute destruction of my former family. The drive back to my farmhouse felt distinctly different from any journey I had made in the past 3 years. The fading afternoon light cast long shadows across the empty county road. When I pulled into the driveway, the isolation of the property did not feel like a vulnerability. It felt like a fortress. The new heavy brass deadbolt gleamed against the painted wood of the front door. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The house was entirely silent. The absence of my son did not feel like a void. It felt like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. I walked into the kitchen and set my keys on the granite island. My smartphone rested in my palm. For 36 months, this device had been a conduit for panic. It had delivered countless frantic messages about failing servers, pending evictions, and sudden vendor lockouts. Now it was merely a piece of glass and metal. It vibrated against my skin, the screen illuminated with a new notification. It was a multimedia text message from Natalie. I swiped the screen to open the message. A high-resolution photograph loaded slowly, revealing a sprawling outdoor terrace. The flooring was polished travertine tile surrounded by ornate wrought iron railings. Beyond the edge of the balcony, the downtown city skyline stretched into the distance, glowing under the twilight. Standing in the center of the terrace was Beatrice. She was wearing a silken robe draped over expensive clothes, holding a crystal flute of champagne. Her head was tilted back in a theatrical laugh, and her eyes were fixed directly on the camera lens. Her expression was radiant with unearned victory. Below the photograph was a single line of text typed by my daughter-in-law. "Thanks for the retirement fund, old man. Try not to starve." I stood in the quiet kitchen and stared at the glowing screen. The sheer magnitude of their arrogance was almost difficult to process. In the world of logistics and freight security, the most dangerous criminals were never the quiet professionals who slipped through the shadows. The ones who inevitably brought down their own syndicates were the amateurs who simply could not resist the urge to gloat. Natalie had just used a personal cellular device to electronically transmit a time-stamped photograph of the primary beneficiary enjoying the direct results of a felony financial theft. She had documented the final destination of my stolen life savings and proudly attached a written confession of her malicious intent. I did not feel a sudden surge of anger. I did not feel the urge to type out a furious reply threatening them with police action. When an adversary is actively constructing their own gallows, you do not interrupt them. I pressed 2 buttons on the side of my device, capturing a permanent digital screenshot of the photograph and the exact wording of the text message. I opened my encrypted email application, attached the image file, and typed Gordon into the recipient line. I left the subject line completely blank and hit send. I placed the phone down on the counter and poured myself a glass of cold water. I remembered the very first time Justin brought Natalie to the farmhouse for a holiday dinner. She had barely stepped through the front door before she began asking pointed questions about the total acreage of the property and the appraised value of the surrounding land. She had looked at my home not as a place of family history, but as a future line item on a balance sheet. I had chosen to ignore that calculating gaze because I wanted my son to be happy. I had allowed my hope for a united family to blind me to the reality of her nature. That willful blindness had nearly cost me my survival. My phone vibrated against the granite countertop. The caller identification displayed the name of the corporate law firm. I accepted the call and lifted the device to my ear. Gordon did not offer a polite greeting. He spoke with the rapid, clipped cadence of a man who had just struck oil. "Vincent." I received the transmission, Gordon said. "Tell me that your daughter-in-law actually sent that photograph from her personal phone number." "She sent it directly to me 5 minutes ago," I replied. I could hear the faint sound of a heavy printer functioning in the background of his office. I have already archived the image and logged the metadata, Gordon stated. Do you understand the legal weight of what she just handed us? When we initiate the civil racketeering lawsuit, their defense attorney would undoubtedly attempt to claim that Justin executed the medical power of attorney out of a genuine desperate concern for your declining health. They would argue he moved the $85,000 to protect it from your supposed cognitive instability. That text message obliterates any potential defense of benevolent intent. It establishes a documented timeline of premeditated financial malice. They are openly mocking your potential starvation while consuming stolen funds. No judge in this state will look at that photograph and feel a shred of sympathy for these people. I took a slow sip of my water. I assumed the image would be useful, I said. It is far more than useful, Vincent Gordon replied, his voice dropping into a lower, more intense register. But that is not why I called you back so quickly. I have spent the last 2 hours dissecting the original corporate documentation you provided, the initial seed money you gave your son 3 years ago, the ongoing infusions of capital, the warehouse deposits. I need you to confirm exactly how you drafted those initial transfer agreements. I set my glass down. Justin begged me for a flexible equity investment, I explained. He wanted me to hand over the cash as an angel investor with no strings attached. I refused. I spent 4 decades auditing corporate supply chains. I do not hand over untethered capital. I told him if he wanted my money, he had to treat me like a commercial bank. I pulled a standard commercial promissory note from my old regional office templates. I made him sign it before I released the first dollar. Gordon let out a sharp breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. You did not just make him sign a promissory note, Vincent. You registered a uniform commercial code financing statement with the state. You legally structured the entire $185,000 as a senior secured commercial loan. Do you realize what that means? It means I am the primary creditor, I said. It means you own the absolute rights to everything, Gordon corrected him. In an equity investment, you absorb the risk if the company fails. But this is a secured debt. The borrower listed on the documents is not Justin. The borrower is his logistics startup, and the collateral listed in the agreement is a blanket lien against all present and future assets acquired by that corporate entity. Justin signed away the rights to everything the company touches. I listened to the steady hum of my refrigerator, processing the absolute finality of his words. Gordon continued, his tone sharp and surgical. Justin has been running a massive shell game. He did not have $85,000 in personal funds to buy that luxury penthouse for Beatrice. He used his corporate accounts as a staging ground. He took your stolen personal savings and moved the cash through his business ledger to mask the origin of the money. Then he wired those corporate funds directly to the real estate escrow agent to close the deal on the condo. He commingled the accounts, I said, the realization settling over me like a heavy iron vault closing shut. Exactly, Gordon stated. By moving the stolen cash through the startup accounts, he fatally infected the real estate transaction. He used corporate capital to fund a private luxury purchase. Because he did that, we can legally pierce the corporate veil. The luxury penthouse Beatrice is standing in right now is no longer shielded as a private residential property. Under the law, it is classified as an asset purchased by the logistics company. And because you hold a senior secured lien against all corporate assets, that luxury penthouse is legally recognized as your stolen collateral. The architecture of the trap was breathtaking in its perfection. Justin believed he was a master manipulator, outsmarting an old man. He had been so blinded by his own greed that he never bothered to read the binding legal language he signed 3 years ago. He only saw the immediate influx of cash. He never considered the invisible chains attached to every single dollar. He thought he was building a real estate empire for his wife and her mother. He had actually spent 3 years constructing a financial guillotine, and he had just willingly placed his own neck on the block. Beatrice is currently celebrating on a balcony that legally belongs to you, Gordon said, his voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. We do not just have the power to freeze their accounts, Vincent. We have the legal authority to seize the concrete and steel of that building. We can take the mother-in-law's home to satisfy the outstanding corporate debt. I looked at the darkened window of my kitchen, seeing my own reflection in the glass. The man staring back was no longer a victim. He was the architect of their absolute ruin. "Draft the seizure documents." Gordon first instructed, my voice devoid of any hesitation. "Prepare the asset freeze. We will let them enjoy their champagne tonight. We will let them sleep in their stolen penthouse. Let them believe they have won. When the trap springs, I want it to sever everything at once. I will have the filings ready for the courts by tomorrow morning," Gordon replied. I ended the call and set the phone down. The silence of the farmhouse felt different now. It was no longer the silence of isolation or betrayal. It was the deep holding breath of a predator waiting in the shadows. The trap was set and the bait was taken. I poured the rest of my water into the sink, turned off the kitchen lights, and walked down the hallway to sleep a deep and dreamless sleep. The heavy oak doors of the law firm closed behind me, shutting out the noise of the city. I sat across from Gordon in his immaculate corner office. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the thick stacks of financial documents spread across the glass desk. Gordon did not offer me coffee or pleasantries. He operated with the sterile precision of a surgeon preparing for an amputation. He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the desk toward me. Inside the folder were the finalized audits of Justin and his logistics startup. Gordon leaned back in his leather chair, resting his elbows on the armrests. He looked at me with a steady, unblinking gaze. He explained that corporate law was designed to protect business owners. It created a legal wall between a person's private assets and their company liabilities. This wall was known as the corporate veil. It was an invisible shield that allowed entrepreneurs to take risks without losing their homes if their businesses failed. But Gordon explained that this shield came with one absolute, unbreakable rule. The owner could never mix personal money with business money. Justin broke that rule, Gordon said, his voice low and even. He did not just break it. He shattered it with breathtaking arrogance. When he took your $15,000, he deposited it directly into his primary operating account. He logged it as a corporate cash infusion. Then, less than 3 hours later, he wired those exact corporate funds out to a private real estate escrow agent to cover the closing costs on a luxury penthouse for his mother-in-law. I looked down at the highlighted bank statements. The trail of numbers was undeniable. I remembered Justin sitting in my kitchen claiming his payroll software had crashed. I remembered the desperation in his voice. It was all a calculated performance designed to extract the final down payment for Beatrice. Because Justin used his corporate ledger as a personal slush fund, Gordon continued the legal protection of his company no longer exists. He co-mingled the assets. He used the business to finance a purely personal luxury purchase for a family member. In the eyes of the law, the logistics startup and Justin are now the exact same entity. We are going to pierce the corporate veil, Chung. The words hung in the quiet air of the office. Piercing the veil meant that every single protective barrier Justin thought he possessed was gone. But the true beauty of the legal maneuver went much deeper. I held a senior secured lien against the startup. When I gave Justin his initial seed money 3 years ago, I filed the paperwork making me the primary creditor. My lien covered all present and future assets acquired by the company. I looked up at Gordon. Since the corporate veil is pierced, I asked slowly, does my lien extend to the penthouse? Gordon offered a thin, predatory smile. Yes, it does, Vincent. Beatrice believes she is sitting on the balcony of her own private sanctuary. She believes her wealthy son-in-law purchased her a penthouse. She is completely unaware that the property was bought with stolen corporate funds. Because those funds are legally recognized as corporate capital, the penthouse itself is now classified as a corporate asset. And because you hold the absolute senior lien on the corporation, the luxury condo is legally recognized as your stolen collateral. You essentially own her home. The magnitude of Justin and his sheer stupidity was staggering. He had constructed his own prison. He thought he was outsmarting an old man. He thought he was transferring my life savings into an untouchable real estate investment for his wife's mother. Instead, he had permanently tethered her new home to my absolute legal control. He had wrapped a chain around his own neck and handed me the padlock. I leaned back in my chair, processing the flawless architecture of the trap. I thought about Beatrice drinking my champagne and laughing in the steakhouse. I thought about Natalie sending me that mocking photograph from the balcony, thanking me for my retirement fund. They were celebrating their victory inside a cage I now controlled. "We can file the seizure documents right now," Gordon stated, tapping a pen against the glass desk. "We can freeze the deed by noon. The state will lock the property. Beatrice will be unable to sell it, transfer it, or borrow against it. The sheriff will serve the eviction notice before the end of the month. We can take the property and liquidate his fake company simultaneously." I looked at the paperwork, waiting for my signature. The desire to strike was powerful. I wanted to authorize the seizure and watch their arrogant world collapse by sunset. But my decades of managing complex supply chains taught me patience. A premature strike might leave a vulnerability. If we moved too quickly, Justin might find a desperate legal loophole. He might try to claim he acted under the broad authority of the medical power of attorney he used to drain my personal bank accounts. He might try to argue that his actions were a misguided attempt to manage my estate. We needed to eliminate every possible avenue of retreat. We needed him to expose his true malicious intent on the public record. "We wait," I told Gordon. Gordon stopped tapping his pen. He raised an eyebrow, questioning my hesitation. "You have the absolute right to destroy him today, Vincent." "Why wait?" "Because he still thinks he is winning," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "He drained my bank accounts yesterday. He believes I am currently sitting in my farmhouse, penniless and terrified. He believes he holds all the cards because he has that medical power of attorney. A man like Justin will not simply walk away and leave me in peace. He knows I discovered the theft at the restaurant. He knows I canceled the corporate card. He is arrogant, but he is also a coward. He will want to ensure I cannot fight back. He will want to permanently silence me before I can cause any more problems for his new lifestyle." Gordon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You think he will escalate the attack?" "I know he will," I replied. "When Justin was a child, he would take toys from the other boys in the neighborhood. If a boy complained or tried to take the toy back, Justin would not apologize. He would immediately run to the teachers and claim the other boy attacked him. He always played the victim to secure his stolen prize. He has not changed. He has only acquired more expensive toys. Right now, he is holding $85,000 of my money, and he knows I am angry. He will try to neutralize me. He will try to use the medical power of attorney to permanently strip me of my rights. He will try to declare me incompetent." Gordon slowly nodded, understanding the tactical brilliance of the delay. "If he petitions a court for adult guardianship, he triggers a massive legal review," Gordon said, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "To secure a guardianship, he must prove he is acting in your best interest as a faithful fiduciary. But the moment he steps into a courtroom to make that claim, we will unleash the financial audit. We will reveal the co-mingled funds, the forged vehicle title, and the stolen life savings dumped into his mother-in-law's real estate." "Exactly," I said. "If we strike now, we are just fighting over stolen money. But if we let him walk into a courtroom and file a fraudulent petition for guardianship, he commits perjury. He commits active elder abuse in front of a judge. He hands us the legal authority to not only seize the condo, but to completely eradicate his freedom. We must let him dig the hole deep enough so that he can never climb out." Gordon smiled again. It was a cold, terrifying expression. "You want to execute a quiet seizure," he verified. "Yes," I said. "I want you to draft all the paperwork to pierce the corporate veil. Prepare the liens against the penthouse. Prepare the criminal referrals for the forged vehicle title Natalie submitted to the state. Have every single document loaded and ready to file. But keep it entirely out of the public record for now. Do not notify their bank. Do not notify their real estate agent. Let Beatrice decorate her new living room. Let Natalie enjoy her stolen truck. Let Justin believe his medical power of attorney makes him a king. We will remain completely silent. We will let them feel secure. I stood up from the leather chair and buttoned my coat. The sunlight in the office felt crisp and sharp. I had spent my entire adult life providing for a son who viewed my love as a weakness. I had endured the subtle disrespect, the ignored phone calls, the discarded advice. I had written checks to cover his mistakes, hoping he would eventually mature into a man of honor. That hope was entirely dead. I was no longer a father trying to guide a lost child. I was a man defending his own life against a coordinated syndicate. Gordon stood and gathered the documents, sliding them back into the thick leather folder. I will have the entire arsenal primed and ready by tomorrow morning, Vincent. The moment he makes his move, the moment he tries to take your freedom, we will drop the hammer. The penthouse will be frozen and his company will be liquidated before he even understands what hit him. I nodded once and turned toward the heavy oak doors. I walked out of the law firm and took the elevator down to the ground floor. I stepped out into the bustling city street, blending perfectly into the crowd of ordinary people. No one looking at me would know that I had just signed the documents to legally obliterate my own flesh and blood. No one would know that my empty bank accounts were merely a decoy. I walked toward my rental car, feeling a profound sense of peace. The trap was fully constructed and invisible to the naked eye. The jaws of the steel trap were pulled back, waiting for the slightest pressure. All I had to do now was go back to my farmhouse, sit in my quiet kitchen, and wait for my son to make his final fatal mistake. The crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway broke the morning silence of the farmhouse. I did not need to look out the window to know who had arrived. I finished wiping down the kitchen counter, aligning the dish towel perfectly parallel to the sink basin. I walked to the front hallway and watched through the narrow side window. 2 vehicles were parked near the porch. One was a sleek white sedan. The other was a marked county police cruiser. 4 figures stepped out into the crisp morning air. Justin and Natalie stood near the sedan looking tense and heavily rehearsed. They were flanked by a uniformed police officer and a severe-looking woman in a gray tailored suit carrying a thick leather binder. It was a tactical formation designed to overwhelm and intimidate. Justin was using the authority of the state as a blunt instrument to break my defenses. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt I had installed only days prior and pulled the door open before they could reach the top step. I stood in the doorway wearing a pressed button-down shirt and clean trousers, projecting an image of absolute stability. The police officer stepped forward, resting his hand near his utility belt. He asked if I was Vincent Pierce. I nodded gently and told him I was. The severe woman stepped up beside the officer and introduced herself as a state-appointed evaluator for Adult Protective Services. She handed me a thick stack of stapled papers. She informed me that an emergency petition for adult guardianship had been filed against me by my son. I looked at the cover page. The document claimed I was suffering from a rapid onset of severe dementia. The supporting evidence listed my paranoid cancellation of credit cards and my erratic, unprovoked hostility at a public restaurant. Justin stood safely behind the officer, projecting an expression of deep sorrow and feigned concern. He told the evaluator that I had not been in my right mind for weeks. Natalie chimed in, adding that they were terrified I was going to hurt myself or destroy my own life out of pure delusion. They expected me to shout. They expected me to tear the papers, throw them off the porch, and curse at my son. An emotional eruption would perfectly validate their claims of erratic hostility. It would give the police officer probable cause to restrain me and the evaluator immediate grounds to declare me a danger to myself. It was an ambush designed to trigger a fatal mistake. I looked at Justin and recognized the fatal flaw in his strategy. He mistook my previous years of silent endurance for weakness. He thought I was a fragile old man who would crumble under the weight of sudden authority. He did not realize he was attacking a man who spent 4 decades thriving in hostile corporate audits. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against the accusations. I looked at the evaluator and offered a polite nod. I stepped back into the foyer and opened the door wide. I told her that I understood she was simply doing her job. I invited all of them inside the house and asked if anyone would like a cup of freshly brewed coffee. The police officer looked slightly confused by my calm demeanor. He exchanged a glance with the evaluator, who merely tightened her grip on her binder and walked into the hallway. Justin and Natalie hesitated on the porch. The complete lack of resistance unnerved them. They stepped inside, looking around the foyer as if expecting a trap. I led the group into the living room and offered them seats. The farmhouse was immaculate. There were no stacks of hoarded mail, no unwashed dishes, no signs of cognitive decay. The floors were polished, the bookshelves were organized, and the morning light poured through crystal-clean windows. I walked into the kitchen and returned a moment later with a silver tray holding a steaming carafe of coffee and ceramic mugs. I poured a cup for the evaluator with a perfectly steady hand. I set it on a coaster on the table right in front of her. The evaluator opened her binder and clicked her pen. She explained that the emergency petition required her to conduct an immediate on-site assessment of my living conditions and my mental acuity. She told me she had to ask a series of standard orientation questions. I sat in the armchair opposite her, resting my hands comfortably on my knees, and told her to proceed. She asked me to state my full name, my date of birth, and the current date. I answered with immediate precision. She asked me to name the current president and the governor of our state. I provided the answers without a fraction of hesitation. Justin shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Natalie crossed her arms tightly over her chest. The performance was not going the way they had scripted it. The evaluator looked down at her notes. She asked me to explain the incident at the restaurant 2 nights ago. She stated that the petition described me wandering into a steakhouse, causing a massive scene and randomly canceling a credit card due to paranoid delusions of theft. I did not exhibit anger. I answered her with the cold, analytical tone of a senior logistics manager explaining a minor routing error. I told her there was no delusion and no erratic hostility. I explained that I had been reviewing my corporate ledgers and identified a severe discrepancy regarding a secured business loan I had provided to my son's company. I stated that I tracked a fraudulent $15,000 withdrawal. I went to the restaurant because I knew my son was dining there. I approached the table with complete composure, presented my legal identification to the restaurant manager, and requested the cancellation of the compromised corporate card to halt an active embezzlement scheme. The evaluator stopped writing. She looked up from her binder and stared at me. She asked if I had proof of this embezzlement. I told her I had absolute forensic proof. I explained that the money had been illegally diverted from a corporate account into a private real estate escrow fund. I told her I acted swiftly and decisively to protect my assets exactly as any competent financial guarantor would do. I kept my voice smooth and unwavering. I did not call Justin a thief. I simply outlined the sequence of events as a matter of logistical record. Justin stood up from the sofa, his face turning a shade of pale red. He pointed at me and told the evaluator I was making up elaborate stories to justify my crazy behavior. He raised his voice, insisting that I was confused and confusing a simple business transaction with a massive conspiracy. He told the police officer that I needed to be taken to a hospital for a psychological hold before I lost all my money. I remained seated and looked at the police officer. I did not speak. I simply let the officer's eyes move between my calm, seated posture and my son's frantic shouting. The contrast was devastating. The officer gently placed a hand on Justin's shoulder and instructed him to sit down and lower his voice. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The authority figures were no longer looking at me as a suspect. They were looking at Justin as the aggressor. Natalie leaned forward, trying to salvage the ambush. She told the evaluator that I had completely isolated myself. She claimed I had changed the locks on my doors to keep my own family away because I was suffering from severe paranoia. She said I was living in a fantasy world and needed round-the-clock supervision for my own safety. I turned my attention to Natalie and offered a polite, reassuring smile. I told the evaluator that I did indeed change the deadbolt on my front door. I explained that I replaced the lock because my son had kicked the previous door open the morning prior, causing significant structural damage to the frame. I calmly gestured toward the front hallway, pointing out the splintered wood surrounding the strike plate that I had not yet had the time to fully repair. I stated that repairing a broken lock after a violent forced entry was not paranoia. It was basic home security. The police officer stood up and walked over to the front entryway. He inspected the splintered wood and the newly installed deadbolt. He turned back to the living room and looked directly at Justin. He asked Justin if he had kicked his elderly father's door open. Justin stammered, grasping for an excuse. He claimed he was just worried and trying to check on me because I was acting crazy. He said he panicked and used force because he thought I might be dead inside the house. I looked at the evaluator and noted that Justin had left immediately after kicking the door open without checking to see if I was injured. I explained that he had only come to demand a wire transfer to replace the credit card I had canceled. I stated these facts without a drop of venom. I was simply an old man clarifying the timeline of events for the official record. The evaluator closed her binder. The narrative my son had carefully woven was entirely dismantled. I was not a fragile, paranoid old man suffering from cognitive decay. I was highly organized, extremely lucid, and terrifyingly calm. I had offered them coffee, invited them into a pristine home, and systematically countered every single accusation using logic and physical evidence. Justin realized his ambush had failed. He could see the skepticism in the evaluator's eyes. He could feel the police officer watching him closely. The state apparatus he had summoned to crush me was now viewing him as a potential threat. He had brought them here to witness a madman, but instead he had exposed his own volatility and desperation. The evaluator stood up and smoothed her gray suit. She thanked me for the coffee and my cooperation. She stated that based on her initial assessment, she saw absolutely no signs of dementia, cognitive impairment, or an inability to care for myself. She told Justin that the emergency petition lacked sufficient observational evidence to proceed with an immediate psychological hold. The ambush was effectively neutralized, but the true counterstrike had not yet begun. I remained in my armchair, watching my son and his wife absorb the reality of their tactical failure. They thought they were cornering a helpless victim. They did not realize they had just walked onto a battlefield entirely of my choosing. I waited in the quiet living room, knowing that the ultimate blow was rapidly approaching up my driveway. I sat in the armchair, watching the silence stretch across my living room. The evaluator had closed her binder, but Justin refused to accept defeat. He stood near the fireplace, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. A sickeningly confident smirk spread across his face. He believed that my quiet compliance was merely the resignation of a broken old man. He assumed that because the state apparatus was physically inside my home, he possessed the ultimate leverage. He thought he had successfully weaponized the legal system against me. Natalie stood beside him, mirroring his arrogance. She looked around my farmhouse with a predatory gleam in her eyes, as if she were already planning how to liquidate my furniture and sell my land. They thought the emergency petition was a flawless mechanism to strip away my autonomy. They believed they had executed a perfect hostile takeover of my life. They were completely unaware that the gravel driveway outside was currently announcing the arrival of their absolute destruction. The heavy crunch of thick tires rolling over crushed stone echoed through the quiet house. I did not move from my chair. I simply watched the front window. A sleek black town car parked directly behind the county police cruiser. The engine cut off, and the car door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud. I knew exactly who was walking up the steps. I took a slow sip of my coffee and waited for the impact. The front door opened with a smooth, deliberate motion. Gordon stepped into the foyer, wiping his shoes on the mat with practiced precision. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a massive leather briefcase. He did not ask for permission to enter my home. He walked directly into the living room, dominating the space instantly. The police officer placed a hand near his utility belt, assessing the sudden arrival of this imposing figure. Justin lost his smirk and demanded to know who had just walked into the house. Gordon ignored my son entirely. He walked straight toward the state-appointed evaluator and introduced himself as my senior legal counsel. He stated his full name and the name of his corporate litigation firm. The evaluator's posture immediately changed. She recognized the firm name and understood that this was no longer a simple domestic dispute over an elderly parent. This was a high-level legal battlefield, and she was standing right in the crossfire. Justin stepped forward, attempting to reclaim his false authority. He told Gordon that this was a private family matter regarding a medical emergency and an adult guardianship. He insisted that corporate lawyers had no jurisdiction over a state welfare check. He raised his voice, demanding that Gordon leave the premises immediately. Gordon slowly turned his head and looked at my son. The contempt in his eyes was absolute and freezing. He told Justin to remain completely silent. He stated that every word spoken from this moment forward was being documented for federal and state prosecution. Gordon placed his heavy briefcase on the polished mahogany coffee table and unlatched the brass locks. He pulled out a thick, bound folder sealed with official medical insignias. He did not waste time arguing against the fraudulent guardianship petition. He did not debate my mental state with my son. He simply handed the sealed folder directly to the evaluator. He instructed her to review the contents before making any further assessments regarding my cognitive health. She opened the folder and began to read the top pages. Gordon explained the contents to the room in a loud and unwavering voice. He stated that exactly 3 days ago I had voluntarily submitted to a comprehensive battery of psychiatric and cognitive evaluations. He listed the names of the 2 board-certified neurologists and the independent forensic psychiatrist who had conducted the extensive exams. He noted that they were the most respected medical specialists in the entire state. He told the evaluator that the medical professionals had thoroughly tested my memory, my executive functioning, and my psychological stability. The results were conclusive and legally verified. The documents proved that I possessed total mental acuity and complete cognitive competence. My cognitive function was registered in the highest possible percentile for my age demographic. There was absolutely no trace of dementia, paranoia, or mental decline. The evaluator looked up from the medical reports. Her face was pale. She looked at Justin and then at the police officer. She stated plainly that the independent medical evaluations completely invalidated the emergency guardianship petition. She told Justin that there were 0 legal or medical grounds to proceed with any psychological hold or involuntary commitment. She closed her binder and physically stepped away from my son. She realized that she had been manipulated and used as a pawn in a malicious scheme. Justin opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the thick stack of medical documents and realized his primary weapon had just been snapped in half. He had relied on the arrogant assumption that an elderly man would be caught off guard and unable to prove his own sanity on the spot. He never anticipated that I would preemptively secure ironclad forensic proof of my own competence before he even filed the paperwork. He failed to realize that a man who spent 40 years managing global supply chains always anticipates a hostile disruption. I had built a fortress around my mind while he was still planning his attack. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. Natalie grabbed Justin's arm, her fingers digging deeply into his sleeve. She whispered frantically that they needed to leave the house immediately. She recognized that the power dynamic had inverted and they were severely outgunned. But the trap was already sprung and the exit was sealed. Gordon closed the medical folder and turned his full attention back to my son. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a second stack of documents. This stack was far thicker than the first. It was bound with heavy legal clips and stamped with the official seal of the State Superior Court. Gordon stepped toward Justin and formally thrust the papers into his chest. Justin reflexively grabbed the stack to stop it from falling. Gordon stated that the police officer present in the room was now acting as an official witness to the lawful service of process. Justin looked down at the bold black text on the cover page. His eyes widened in absolute terror. Gordon did not give him time to process the dense legal jargon. He explained the contents with lethal precision. He told Justin that he had just been officially served with a civil racketeering lawsuit under the RICO Act. He listed the charges aloud, so the police officer and the evaluator could hear every single damning word. He accused Justin of felony fiduciary fraud, elder financial abuse, and massive corporate embezzlement. He explained that Justin had weaponized a stale medical document to bypass bank security and steal $85,000 from a vulnerable family member. He then detailed how Justin had illegally commingled those stolen personal funds with his corporate startup ledger to mask the theft. Gordon explained that this act of financial sabotage destroyed any legal protections the startup possessed. Natalie began to breathe heavily, backing away toward the front door. Gordon turned his predatory gaze to her and informed her that she was officially named as a co-conspirator in the federal lawsuit. He pointed out that she had submitted a forged vehicle title to the Department of Motor Vehicles in a desperate and clumsy attempt to limit my physical mobility. He told the police officer that the criminal referrals for the grand theft auto and the felony forgery were already sitting on the district attorney's desk awaiting immediate prosecution. The police officer placed his hand firmly on his radio. He looked at Justin and Natalie with intense suspicion. He realized he was not here to protect society from a crazy old man. He was standing in a room with two active criminals who had just been exposed. He took a step closer to the door, blocking their easiest path of escape. Justin dropped the heavy legal documents onto the floor. His hands were shaking violently. He shouted that I could not do this to him. He claimed that the logistics startup was a separate legal entity and that his mother-in-law's penthouse was protected real estate. He insisted that my lawsuit was a bluff and that he would drag me through court for years. Gordon smiled his signature cold smile. He informed Justin that the corporate veil had already been successfully pierced by a judge that very morning. He explained that because Justin used the corporate account to launder the stolen cash, the luxury condominium was legally recognized as stolen corporate collateral. The barrier separating personal theft and business assets was completely obliterated. Gordon leaned in close and delivered the final devastating blow. He told Justin that the property deed for the penthouse had been frozen 3 hours ago by court order. He stated that Beatrice was currently living in a seized asset that belonged entirely to the Ironclad Logistics Trust. She was essentially a squatter in my property, and her eviction notice was already in the mail. The color drained completely from my son's face. He looked at me sitting calmly in my armchair, drinking my coffee. The illusion of his dominance shattered into dust. He finally understood that he had not outsmarted an isolated old man. He had walked blindly into a financial slaughterhouse. He had handed me the exact tools I needed to eradicate his company, seize his mother-in-law's home, and send his wife to prison. I had let him bring the police and the state evaluator into my home just so they could witness his total destruction. The trap had snapped shut, breaking every bone in his fragile empire. Gordon stood in the center of my living room, projecting the absolute authority of a judge delivering a final sentence. Justin was staring down at the thick stack of papers detailing the civil racketeering lawsuit. His hands trembled so violently that the edges of the documents rattled against each other. The police officer remained perfectly still near the front door, watching my son with the sharp, calculating gaze of a law enforcement professional who had just realized who the actual criminal in the room was. The court-appointed evaluator had already taken 3 distinct steps backward, physically distancing herself from the couple she had accompanied to my home. Justin finally forced his eyes away from the lawsuit and looked at Gordon. He stammered out a weak defense, claiming that the medical power of attorney gave him total control over my finances. He insisted that moving the $85,000 was a legally protected action because he was explicitly authorized to act as my designated proxy. He thought he could use loud indignation to shield himself from the terrifying legal reality closing in around him. He believed that holding a piece of paper notarized 5 years ago was an impenetrable shield against any accusations of theft. Gordon did not raise his voice, but his tone was sharp enough to cut through solid steel. Gordon explained that executing a medical power of attorney was not a blank check for unlimited, unverified theft. He stated that the exact moment Justin invoked that specific document at the bank, he legally bound himself to a strict fiduciary duty. Gordon explained to the silent room that a fiduciary is mandated by both state and federal law to act exclusively in the best financial interest of the vulnerable principal. He told Justin that stealing an elderly man's life savings to finance a luxury real estate purchase for a different family member was the exact legal definition of felony fiduciary fraud. Gordon reached into his heavy leather briefcase and produced another bound folder. He held up the thick folder so the police officer could clearly see the official state seals stamped on the cover. He explained that our independent forensic accountants had completed a full financial audit of the logistics startup overnight. The final audit was formally filed with the state Supreme Court at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Gordon stated that the audit successfully tracked every single dollar Justin stole from my high-yield savings account. It mapped the exact trajectory of the money as it flowed through his corporate ledger and was immediately wired to the real estate escrow agent handling Beatrice and her new penthouse. Justin opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. He realized that his brilliant plan to launder the stolen cash through his business was actually a fatal miscalculation. Gordon reminded him that the CO mingling of stolen personal funds with corporate capital had completely destroyed the corporate veil. The logistics startup was legally compromised, and my senior secured lien now extended to every single asset purchased with those tainted funds. Justin had willingly tied a knot connecting my stolen money directly to his mother-in-law's new home. Gordon turned his attention away from my son and focused entirely on Natalie. My daughter-in-law had backed herself against the arm of the sofa, her face entirely drained of color. Gordon stepped toward her, holding a single sheet of heavy legal paper bearing the signature of a superior court judge. He extended his arm and held the document directly in front of her face. Natalie hesitated, but the sheer commanding presence of my attorney forced her to take the paper from his hand. She looked down at the dense legal text and let out a short, terrified gasp. Gordon spoke with methodical, absolute cruelty. He informed Natalie that she was holding an emergency asset freeze order. He explained that because her mother's luxury condominium was purchased using embezzled corporate capital, the state had officially classified the property as stolen commercial collateral. Gordon stated that the judge had signed the injunction exactly 2 hours ago. The deed to the penthouse was completely locked by the local municipal government. Gordon continued explaining the absolute finality of the court order. He told her that the luxury property could not be sold on the open market. It could not be refinanced under any circumstances. No lines of credit could be opened against its appraised value. He watched her slowly process the total destruction of her mother's future. And most importantly, Gordon added the penthouse could not be legally occupied by the beneficiaries of the ongoing fraud. I sat quietly in my armchair, watching the absolute terror wash over Natalie. She finally understood the sheer magnitude of the trap they had walked into. She whispered that her mother was already moving her furniture into the building. She said Beatrice was currently unpacking boxes in the massive living room. Gordon smiled a cold, mirthless smile. He told Natalie that Beatrice was currently moving her personal belongings into a seized asset that belonged entirely to the Ironclad Logistics Trust. He explained that Beatrice was legally classified as an unauthorized squatter occupying stolen commercial collateral. The municipal sheriff already possessed the physical eviction order. He told Natalie that her mother would be forcibly removed from the premises by armed deputies before the end of the week. The devastation in the room was absolute and complete. Justin and Natalie had arrived at my farmhouse with a police officer intending to strip me of my human rights, lock me in a secure psychiatric ward, and seize the remainder of my property. They had orchestrated a cruel morning ambush designed to prey on my supposed vulnerability and age. Instead, they had walked directly into a flawless financial execution. They had handed Gordon the exact physical proximity he needed to serve them with federal lawsuits and asset seizures under the watchful eyes of state authorities. They had effectively brought the police to their own active crime scene. The police officer stepped away from the front door and walked directly up to Justin. The officer asked Gordon if the criminal referrals for the forged vehicle title and the fiduciary embezzlement had already been formally submitted to the district attorney. Gordon nodded and stated that the local prosecutor received the complete evidentiary file at dawn. He noted that the Financial Crimes Division was already actively reviewing the forged signature on the Department of Motor Vehicles transfer document Natalie had mailed to the state. The officer looked at Natalie and told her that she needed to retain a criminal defense attorney immediately. He stated that he would be filing a detailed official incident report regarding their bold attempt to use the police department to execute a fraudulent adult guardianship. He made it perfectly clear that their attempt to manipulate law enforcement would be heavily documented in the upcoming criminal proceedings. Justin dropped to his knees. The thick stack of the civil racketeering lawsuit spilled across the polished hardwood floor. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. He called me Dad and begged me to stop the lawyers. He claimed he was just stressed about his failing company and that Beatrice had aggressively pressured him into securing the penthouse. He tried to shift the entire blame to his wife and his mother-in-law, abandoning them instantly to save himself from prison. He promised to give all the money back. He promised to tear up the medical power of attorney. He begged me to remember that he was my only son and that families should forgive each other. I remained seated, holding my ceramic coffee mug. I looked down at the broken man kneeling on my floor. I felt absolutely no pity and no sorrow. The paternal bond that had chained me to his endless, selfish demands was completely severed. I told Justin that a son does not forge state documents to steal his father's truck. I told him a son does not weaponize a medical emergency proxy to empty his father's savings account. I told him a son does not bring state officials to his father's home to forcefully declare him insane. I kept my voice perfectly flat and level. I informed him that the $85,000 was no longer the primary issue. The issue was that he had introduced a hostile toxic infection into my life, and I was surgically excising it. I told him he had tragically mistaken a lifetime of quiet patience for a lack of intelligence. I wanted him to understand that every arrogant action he took over the past 72 hours had simply handed me the legal leverage to destroy his entire future. Gordon buttoned his suit jacket and turned to the evaluator. He told her that her services were no longer required at this address. The evaluator nodded quickly, eager to escape the epicenter of the unfolding legal disaster. She practically ran toward the front door, disappearing into the cool morning air. The police officer instructed Justin and Natalie to leave the property immediately. He warned them that any attempt to return to the farmhouse or contact me directly would result in their immediate arrest for trespassing and witness intimidation. Natalie grabbed Justin's arm and pulled him up from the floor. He was sobbing openly, his face slick with tears and sweat. They stumbled toward the exit, moving with the uncoordinated steps of people who had just survived a catastrophic physical impact. They left the scattered lawsuit documents behind them, resting on the wood floor. They walked out of my house completely broken, stripped of their arrogance, their money, and their carefully planned future. I did not follow them to the door to watch them leave. I simply stayed in my chair and took another slow sip of my coffee. Gordon and I stood in the quiet living room, listening to the sound of their sedan speeding frantically down the gravel driveway. The silence that settled over the farmhouse afterward was absolute and perfectly clean. Exactly 14 days passed since the morning Justin and Natalie stood in my living room and watched their fraudulent world collapse. I spent those 2 weeks in complete absolute silence. I did not reach out to my son, and I ignored the erratic barrage of voicemails he left from various disposable phone numbers. The farmhouse was peaceful. I spent my mornings repairing the wooden doorframe that Justin had violently kicked open. I sanded the splintered oak and applied a fresh coat of sealant, working with the slow, methodical patience of a man who no longer had any urgent crises to solve. My 4 decades in corporate logistics had taught me that the final stages of a major operation required zero emotional interference. You simply allow the established protocols to execute themselves, and you watch the system correct the disruption. Gordon handled the legal machinery with ruthless efficiency. He secured the final writ of execution from the county judge, effortlessly converting the temporary asset freeze into a permanent commercial seizure. Justin attempted to file an emergency motion to block the action, but he had no money left to retain a competent defense attorney. He tried to represent his failing startup in court as a sole proprietor, but the judge dismissed his rambling excuses in less than 10 minutes. The corporate veil remained pierced, and my senior secured lien remained absolute. The luxury penthouse was no longer a disputed asset. It was officially, legally, and permanently mine. On the morning of the eviction, I did not drive into the city to watch Beatrice lose her home. Seeking visual pleasure in the suffering of others was a weakness I did not indulge. I stayed in my kitchen drinking black coffee and reviewing the updated ledger for the Ironclad Logistics Trust. At exactly 9 o'clock, my phone vibrated against the granite countertop. It was a brief encrypted message from Gordon, confirming that the municipal sheriff's deputies had arrived at the luxury building in the downtown district. I closed my eyes and envisioned the logistical sequence of the operation. Beatrice would be drinking her morning tea, perhaps admiring the city skyline from her expensive balcony. She would hear a firm, heavy knock on her solid mahogany door. When she opened it, she would not find a friendly concierge bringing her packages. She would face 2 armed deputies holding an official court mandate, ordering the immediate vacation of the premises. She would try to argue. She would demand to call her son-in-law, believing that Justin still possessed some magical financial authority to fix the situation. She would slowly realize that the deputies did not care about her social status or her loud complaints. They were agents of the state executing a commercial foreclosure on stolen corporate collateral. They would give her exactly 30 minutes to gather her essential daily medications and a single suitcase of clothing before the property managers changed the electronic locks. All the imported furniture, all the expensive artwork, and all the custom decorations remained inside the unit. Because Beatrice and Natalie had used corporate funds to pay for the interior design, those luxury items were now legally classified as fixtures of the seized corporate asset. Gordon sent a second message an hour later, confirming that the physical eviction was successfully completed without any violent incidents. The property was now entirely vacant and securely locked under the exclusive authority of my trust. The $1 million asset was fully integrated into my ghost line. I placed my phone back on the counter and walked out to the back porch. The morning air was crisp and clean. I looked out over the sprawling acres of my property, feeling a profound sense of equilibrium. The financial wounds inflicted by my son were fully cauterized. The stolen capital had been forcibly extracted from their greedy hands and converted into solid concrete equity. Shortly before noon, my phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed an unknown local number. Justin and Natalie had been permanently blocked on all my devices, but I knew Beatrice would eventually find a way to circumvent the digital perimeter. I accepted the call and lifted the phone to my ear without saying a single word. The sound of hysterical sobbing immediately filled the speaker. It was a wet, desperate sound, completely devoid of the refined elegance Beatrice always tried to project to the world. She was likely standing on the street corner outside the luxury building, watching her stolen empire evaporate into the city air. "Vincent, please, you have to help me," Beatrice wept, her voice trembling with sheer panic. "You have to call the police and tell them there has been a terrible mistake. They threw me out into the street like a common criminal. They locked the doors and told me the condo belongs to your company. You cannot let them do this to me. I am an old woman, Vincent. I have nowhere to go. My medications are still in the bathroom cabinet." I leaned against the wooden railing of my porch and listened to her beg. I remembered the photograph Natalie had sent me exactly 14 days ago. I pictured Beatrice standing on that same balcony, wearing her silk robe and holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. She had smiled at the camera, knowing perfectly well that my life savings had funded her lavish lifestyle. She had boldly captioned the photo, mocking my survival. She had gladly accepted the fruits of elder financial abuse without asking a single question about where a struggling logistics startup founder suddenly found the massive amount of cash required to buy a penthouse outright. She had been perfectly content to watch me starve as long as her comfort was guaranteed. "Vincent, please say something," Beatrice sobbed, her breathing growing shallow and erratic. It was Justin. It was all Justin. I had absolutely no idea where the money came from. I swear to you, I did not know he stole it from your personal accounts. He told Natalie and me that his business was booming and he wanted to take care of us. He lied to me, Vincent. He ruined my life and he ruined my daughter's life. You cannot punish me for the crimes of your terrible son. You have to let me back into the apartment. Just give me a few months to figure things out. Please show some mercy." Her attempt to shift the entire burden of guilt onto Justin was utterly predictable. When parasites are cornered, they immediately turn on their host. Beatrice was entirely willing to throw her son-in-law to the wolves to save her own housing situation. She wanted me to believe she was merely an innocent victim caught in the crossfire of a tragic family dispute. But innocence requires a total lack of complicity. Beatrice had actively pressured Justin for years, demanding higher social status and better accommodations. She had fueled his desperate greed, constantly pushing him to extract more resources to satisfy her bottomless vanity. She was the quiet architect of his financial desperation. I kept my voice absolutely flat and void of any emotional inflection. I told her that ignorance of a felony fraud does not grant a person legal immunity to keep the stolen assets. I explained that she was currently standing outside a commercial property that was legally seized to satisfy a massive unverified debt. I stated that she was never the rightful owner of the penthouse. She was merely an unauthorized occupant living inside my stolen collateral. "But I have nothing left." Beatrice wailed, her voice breaking into a shrill shriek. "Justin convinced me to sell my old house to help cover the interior decorations for the new place. That money is completely gone. I gave it all to Natalie to buy custom furniture and imported rugs for the living room. All of my personal savings were poured into renovating that penthouse to make it perfect. And the deputies told me I cannot even take the antique dining table because it is legally seized as a permanent fixture. You took my home and you took my money. I am completely homeless, Vincent. You are a wealthy man. You do not need this condominium. You already have your farmhouse and your pension. If you keep this property, you are sending me to a homeless shelter. You cannot be this cruel to family." I looked out at the old oak trees lining the edge of my property, processing the absolute poetic justice of her situation. Beatrice had drained her own independent wealth to decorate a property that legally belonged to me. She had freely poured her money into upgrading my seized commercial collateral. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of a son who would forge his father's signature to steal a truck. I thought about a daughter-in-law who would mock an elderly man while draining his retirement funds. I thought about a mother-in-law who happily consumed the harvest of my 40 years of labor without a shred of gratitude. They had drained my bank accounts and tried to strip away my fundamental human rights by declaring me insane. They had planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward so they could sell my farmhouse and spend the rest of my money in total peace. Now the woman who had happily endorsed my destruction was demanding mercy because the trap she helped build had violently snapped shut on her own leg. I did not feel a single drop of pity for her tears. I did not feel any moral obligation to shield her from the brutal consequences of her own boundless greed. She had lived her entire life manipulating others to secure her own comfort, and now the final bill had arrived. I spoke directly into the receiver, ensuring every word was delivered with absolute, terrifying clarity. "You enjoyed the champagne?" "Beatrice," I said, my tone dropping to a cold whisper. "Now pay the tab." I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call permanently. I immediately navigated to the security settings on my device and blocked the unknown number, ensuring she could never reach me again. The digital perimeter was fully restored. The financial extraction was complete. The hostile elements had been surgically removed from my existence. I slid the phone into my pocket and walked back inside the farmhouse, enjoying the profound and unbroken silence of my reclaimed life. The morning air was thick with the threat of rain as I drove my rental car into the downtown financial district. The sky was a bruised shade of gray, casting a somber light over the concrete buildings. I parked in the underground structure beneath the county courthouse and walked toward the elevators. My mind was entirely clear. For the past 30 days, my life had been an exercise in tactical survival. I had secured a blind trust, fortified my digital perimeter, and watched my adversaries slowly suffocate inside a financial cage of their own making. Today was the culmination of that quiet war. Today, the invisible trap would snap completely shut under the full weight of the judicial system. I met Gordon in the expansive marble lobby of the courthouse. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and carried his signature heavy leather briefcase. He did not offer a comforting smile or small talk. He simply gave a curt, professional nod and led the way through the metal detectors and security checkpoints. We walked down the echoing corridor toward the assigned courtroom. I did not feel any lingering dread or anxiety. I felt the absolute cold equilibrium of a man who had successfully isolated a toxic threat. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors and took our seats at the plaintiff's table. The courtroom was sterile and imposing, bathed in harsh fluorescent lighting that stripped away any illusions. We sat in silence, waiting for the final act to begin. 15 minutes later, the heavy doors at the back of the room opened. Justin and Natalie walked down the center aisle. The physical transformation in their appearance was staggering. They no longer carried themselves with the arrogant entitlement they displayed when they tried to ambush me in my living room. They looked utterly destroyed. Justin wore a suit that hung loosely on his depleted frame. The fabric was unpressed and wrinkled. He had dark, exhausted circles under his bloodshot eyes and a heavy shadow of stubble on his jaw. Natalie followed closely behind him, keeping her eyes glued to the floor. She looked pale and entirely hollow. The stress of the seized luxury penthouse, the frozen bank accounts, and the looming threat of absolute ruin had physically eroded their vanity. They sat down at the defense table looking like two survivors clinging to driftwood who suddenly realized there was no rescue boat coming for them. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. The judge was an older man with a reputation for zero tolerance regarding fiduciary abuse and elder fraud. He took his seat at the high wooden bench and adjusted his reading glasses. He looked down at the massive stack of documents Gordon had filed that morning. The hearing commenced, and Gordon stood up to address the court. Gordon did not rely on emotional theatrics or raised voices. He executed the legal dismantling with surgical precision. He began by laying out the chronological sequence of the theft. He detailed exactly how Justin had weaponized a stale 5-year-old medical proxy to bypass banking security protocols and illegally drain $85,000 from my life savings. Gordon presented the certified bank records, proving that Justin had funneled those stolen personal funds directly through his corporate logistics account. He showed the judge the exact wire transfers indicating the money was then sent to a real estate escrow agent to purchase a luxury penthouse for Beatrice. Justin stood up, gripping the edge of the defense table with trembling hands. He desperately tried to interrupt the proceedings. He stammered out a frantic defense, claiming that it was all a tragic misunderstanding. He told the judge that he was simply trying to protect my assets because I was suffering from severe cognitive decline. He tried to rely on the exact same fraudulent narrative he had attempted to use when he brought the state evaluator to my farmhouse. The judge silenced my son instantly with a single sharp crack of his gavel. He picked up the heavy binder containing the independent psychiatric evaluations Gordon had submitted. The judge looked directly at Justin and stated that the board-certified neurologists had found my mental acuity to be flawless. He informed the courtroom that submitting a fraudulent claim of dementia to justify stealing an elderly father's money was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated predatory felony. Gordon then moved to the final devastating phase of the presentation. He handed the judge the verified forensic audit and the forged Department of Motor Vehicles title for my pickup truck. Gordon explained that the corporate veil of the logistics startup was permanently shattered, the exact second Justin Coe mingled the stolen funds. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew incredibly heavy as the judge delivered his ruling. His voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, leaving absolutely no room for appeal. He declared that Justin had acted with extreme malice and absolute bad faith. With a firm strike of his gavel, the judge officially stripped my son of all fiduciary standing and permanently revoked the medical power of attorney. He decreed that the logistics startup was an active vehicle for money laundering and ordered its immediate total liquidation. Every single server, every computer, and every remaining dollar in the corporate accounts would be seized and auctioned to satisfy my senior secured lien. Justin was no longer a corporate executive. He was a bankrupt man with a dissolved and disgraced company. But the financial annihilation was only the first part of the sentence. The judge picked up the forged vehicle title Natalie had mailed to the state registry. He stared at the clumsy forgery of my signature before turning his gaze to the defense table. He stated that civil court was designed to resolve monetary disputes, but forgery and grand theft auto were matters of state security. The judge formally announced that he was referring the forged vehicle title and the mountain of evidence proving bank fraud directly to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. Natalie let out a choked, suffocating gasp. She buried her pale face in her trembling hands. The sheer reality of a looming prison sentence completely crushed the last remaining fragments of her arrogant facade. She finally realized that her quiet attempt to steal my truck had just handed a state prosecutor a perfectly documented felony with her name all over it. The judge slammed his gavel down one final time, concluding the hearing and sealing their absolute destruction. Gordon packed his legal files back into his leather briefcase with his usual sterile efficiency. We stood up and walked out of the courtroom together. We stepped into the long, echoing marble hallway and moved toward the elevator bank. I did not turn my head to look back at the defense table. The hostile elements had been neutralized, and the operation was successfully concluded. I pressed the elevator button and waited in the quiet corridor, listening to the low hum of the building. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open behind us. Justin burst into the hallway, running toward me with a frantic, uncoordinated stumble. He closed the distance and collapsed heavily against the cold marble wall right next to the elevator doors. He was completely broken. The false confidence, the sneering entitlement, and the boundless cruelty had been entirely burned away. All that remained was raw, pathetic terror. Tears streamed freely down his unwashed face, and his chest heaved with violent, ragged sobs. He looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes that mirrored the sheer panic of an animal caught in a steel trap. He begged me to call off the lawyers and speak to the district attorney. He pleaded with me to drop the criminal referrals before the prosecutor filed the warrants. He cried that if the state moved forward with the felony charges, he would go to a federal penitentiary. He sobbed uncontrollably, telling me that Natalie was already packing her bags and preparing to file for an emergency divorce to save herself from his complete financial collapse. He told me that Beatrice was living in a motel because her stolen penthouse was locked and seized. He gasped for air, claiming he had absolutely nothing left in the world. He had lost his company, he had lost his home, and he was about to lose his fundamental freedom. He reached out with trembling, sweat-slicked hands and grabbed the fabric of my coat. He squeezed the material tightly, begging me to save him from the ruin he had built. He told me through his tears that he was my only son, and he promised he would spend the rest of his natural life making it up to me. I stood perfectly still in the sterile marble hallway. I looked down at the weeping man clinging to my coat. I remembered the decades of quiet labor I had freely given to ensure he always had a safety net beneath him. I remembered the late nights auditing global supply chains just to pay for his college tuition, his cars, and his endless, selfish demands. I remembered standing completely alone in a bright pharmacy, feeling the cold, absolute panic of realizing my life savings had been stolen while I was recovering from a major surgery. I remembered the smug digital photograph of Beatrice drinking expensive champagne on a balcony funded by my stolen labor. I remembered him standing on my front porch alongside a police officer in a malicious attempt to declare me insane and strip me of my human rights. He was waiting for a lifeline. He was waiting for the unconditional paternal grace that he had exploited, mocked, and abused his entire life. He believed that no matter how deep the betrayal cut, I would eventually reach down into the darkness and pull him out of the fire. I gently reached up and removed his trembling fingers from my coat. I looked directly into his terrified eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but the clean, peaceful void of total detachment. The emotional tether that once bound me to him was permanently severed. I spent my life paying for your survival. Justin, I told him, my voice completely flat and unyielding. I will not pay for your absolution. The elevator doors chimed a bright mechanical note and slid smoothly open behind me. I turned my back on my son, leaving him sobbing on the cold marble floor. I stepped into the empty elevator car, and the heavy metal doors closed permanently, shutting him out of my world forever. The morning air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and pine. I stood at the end of the gravel driveway, watching the heavy tires of the moving truck compress the loose stones. Two men in thick canvas jackets were loading the last of my essential belongings into the back of the truck. I had instructed them to take only the items that held genuine practical value. The heavy oak furniture, the antique silver, the massive dining table where my son used to sit in sullen silence were all gone. They had been liquidated weeks ago. I kept only my books, a few comfortable chairs, my tools, and the simple items required to maintain a quiet life. The massive farmhouse that had been my anchor for decades was entirely empty. I did not feel a trace of sorrow as I looked at the vast, sweeping roofline and the wide, wraparound porch. I felt the profound lightness of a man who had just successfully unloaded a tremendous burden. This property had been the crown jewel of my son's presumed inheritance. He had spent years walking across this land, mentally calculating its market value and planning how quickly he would sell it the moment my heart stopped beating. He had viewed my home not as a sanctuary, but as a delayed payout. Now that payout was permanently erased from his future. A modest sedan pulled into the driveway and parked near the empty garage. A young couple stepped out of the vehicle holding the hands of a small boy. They were the new owners. I had not listed the property on the open market for corporate developers or wealthy investors to blindly purchase. I had instructed Gordon to find a hardworking family who actually needed the space and possessed the genuine desire to cultivate the land. The young man worked as a local mechanic, and his wife was a public school teacher. They had saved for a decade to afford a proper home. I sold them the farmhouse and the surrounding acreage for a fraction of its actual market value. The transaction was a deliberate surgical strike against my son's greed. I had legally transferred the legacy he coveted to complete strangers who possessed the humility and grace he entirely lacked. The young man walked up to me and offered a firm, grateful handshake. He thanked me again for the opportunity, noting that his son would finally have a proper yard to play in. I nodded and told him the land required patience, but it would always reward honest labor. I handed him the heavy brass keys to the front door. The physical transfer of those keys was the final logistical step in my complete extraction. I watched the small boy run across the green lawn, his laughter echoing in the quiet morning air. The farmhouse was no longer a monument to my past sacrifices. It was a foundation for their new future. I turned away from this property and walked to my car. I started the engine and drove down the gravel path without looking back through the rearview mirror. The county road stretched out before me, winding through the familiar valleys and green pastures I had navigated for over 40 years. The drive was peaceful and rhythmic. The aggressive noise of the past month, the frantic phone calls, the courtroom drama, the desperate ambushes had all dissolved into the steady hum of the tires against the asphalt. I was completely untethered from the toxic machinery of my previous life. The landscape slowly began to shift as I drove further north. The flat agricultural grids gave way to rolling hills and dense evergreen forests. The elevation climbed steadily, and the air filtering through the ventilation system grew noticeably colder and thinner. I was leaving the epicenter of my old corporate existence and entering a geography defined by isolation and natural endurance. I had spent my entire adult life managing complex global supply chains, anticipating disasters, and absorbing the failures of the people around me. I had carried the weight of my son's endless demands and my late wife's quiet expectations. For decades, my identity was entirely defined by what I could provide for others. The road ascending into the mountains represented the physical dismantling of that identity. I thought about Justin and Natalie as the elevation increased. They were currently navigating the brutal reality of their absolute bankruptcy. They had no penthouse, no logistics startup, no inheritance, and no wealthy father to absorb the impact of their poor decisions. They were facing the unforgiving machinery of the criminal justice system completely alone. I felt a deep, steady calm, knowing that I was no longer responsible for their survival. I had spent millions of dollars and countless hours trying to teach my son the value of honest labor and personal accountability. He had actively refused every lesson, preferring the lazy arrogance of theft and manipulation. The universe would now teach him the lessons he refused to learn from me. After 3 hours of driving, I turned onto a narrow dirt road carved into the side of a steep mountain ridge. The road was lined with ancient towering pines that blocked out the morning sun, casting long, cool shadows across the path. The car climbed higher until the road finally ended at a small clearing. I parked the vehicle and stepped out into the absolute stillness of the high-altitude air. My new home stood at the edge of the clearing. It was a modest single-story cabin built from heavy timber and native stone. It was beautifully simple and entirely functional. There was no vast estate to manage, no sprawling lawns to maintain, and no empty guest rooms to echo with the failures of the past. The cabin featured a solid metal roof, a wide wooden porch facing the valley below, and a heavy stone chimney. It was a fortress designed for solitary endurance. The moving truck had arrived an hour before me. The movers had already unloaded my few remaining possessions and departed, leaving me completely alone in the silent wilderness. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and stepped inside. The interior smelled of raw cedar and cold stone. The space was immaculate and highly organized, exactly as I required. I walked into the small kitchen and located the single cardboard box I had designated for my immediate arrival. I opened the box with a pocket knife and methodically unpacked the contents. I removed my favorite ceramic mug, a bag of dark roasted coffee beans, and a simple metal French press. I moved with deliberate, unhurried precision. There were no urgent meetings to attend, no corporate fires to extinguish, and no family crises to manage. Time belonged entirely to me. I filled a kettle with fresh water and placed it on the stove. I ground the coffee beans, inhaling the rich, bitter aroma that filled the small kitchen. The mundane ritual of brewing coffee felt profoundly different here. It was no longer a necessary stimulant to survive a hostile day. It was a quiet celebration of my newly reclaimed autonomy. I poured the steaming water over the dark grounds, watching the dark liquid bloom and settle. I pressed the metal plunger down and filled my ceramic mug, feeling the deep, comforting heat transfer to my palms. I carried the mug through the living room and stepped out onto the back porch. The view was staggering. The porch overlooked a massive plunging valley, surrounded by jagged, snow-capped peaks. A dense blanket of green pine trees stretched out for miles in every direction. There were no other houses, no roads, no power lines, no signs of human interference. The isolation was absolute and perfect. I sat down in a sturdy wooden rocking chair, facing the vast expanse of the valley. The wind moved through the pine needles, creating a low, rushing sound, like the ocean breaking against a distant shore. I took a slow sip of the black coffee, allowing the bitter warmth to coat my throat. I placed my book on the small wooden table next to my chair and leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment to fully absorb the profound silence. A sharp electronic vibration broke the stillness. I opened my eyes and looked at the small glass table. My mobile phone was buzzing aggressively against the wood. The screen illuminated, displaying an unknown incoming number. It was not a saved contact, and it was not an authorized caller. I knew exactly who was on the other end of that invisible signal. It was Justin, or perhaps Natalie, calling from a prepaid disposable device. They had likely exhausted all their legal options and exhausted the patience of their remaining enablers. They were facing the crushing reality of their impending criminal trials and their total financial ruin. They were calling to beg for a reprieve. They wanted to cry into the receiver, offer empty apologies, and demand the unearned absolution they believed was their permanent birthright. They expected me to answer the phone because they still believed deep down that the old man would eventually break, that the father would inevitably sacrifice himself to save the son. I did not feel a spike of anger. I did not feel the urge to answer the call and deliver a final punishing lecture. The time for communication had permanently expired. I simply watched the screen flash with a dull mechanical rhythm. Next to the phone sat a tall glass of cold water I had carried out to the porch. I reached forward and picked up the vibrating mobile device. I did not press the button to silence the call. I did not decline the connection. I held the phone over the glass and simply let it slip from my fingers. The device hit the water with a soft, muted splash. It sank immediately to the bottom of the glass. The screen flickered wildly under the water, casting a distorted glow against the glass before abruptly short-circuiting. The light died completely, and the aggressive vibration ceased. The device was permanently destroyed, severing the final microscopic thread connecting me to the world of my adversaries. I picked up my book and opened it to the first page. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I sat in my wooden chair looking out over the endless mountain valley. The only sound left in the world was the wind rushing through the ancient pines. Order was fully restored. The silence was finally entirely my own. True familial love is not measured by the endless sacrifice of one person to satisfy the boundless greed of another. When boundaries are repeatedly violated and respect is completely discarded, walking away becomes the ultimate act of self-preservation. Enabling destructive behavior does not save the abuser, it merely destroys the provider. True peace can only be achieved when we stop subsidizing the cruelty of those who view our affection as a weakness. Reclaiming your life requires the profound courage to sever toxic ties and step into a quiet, dignified future entirely on your own terms. If this story resonated with your own experiences of setting difficult family boundaries, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more narratives about reclaiming your peace.